Something I do want to point out here is that both synchronous and asynchronous provide interaction, especially from the perspective of adult learning theory, but it has been described as the asynchronous session meeting the needs for autonomy and flexibility that Bandura talked about in the 90s. So when we're talking about adult learning theory, asynchronous discussion can actually meet those two things better, flexibility and autonomy, because they have more time and they can go in whenever they want. All right, before we head into our next discussion, which is going to be a bit more didactic, I am going to ask you to fill out a quick Mentimeter poll. And Graham, if you could drop that link in the chat for us, that would be great. Ta-da! So Graham has put a link in the chat to Mentimeter. So if you could click that, I am asking you to respond to the question, why do we include discussions in our courses? Yes, I am assuming that we all include discussions since we're here, but while you're doing that, I am going to share my screen so that you can see these results that are coming up. Okay, so we're seeing comments such as gauging if students are understanding, engagement, facilitating application of content, checking for understanding, reinforce verbal learning, assuming this is an in-class discussion, yes. The opportunity to show what they learn, giving students an opportunity to share, hearing different perspectives. All of these are great reasons for including discussion. So from looking at the literature, and I will share these slides after, I'll send them in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to copy everything down. When we think about why do we include discussions, the main reason that often comes up is applying social constructivist theory. So here we're saying that we want to have students construct learning. Adults want meaningful learning experiences. So in order to create meaningful learning online, the easiest way for most of us to see this is through discussion. So we have discussion to create those constructive spaces for people to create and construct their learning. You know, picking apart questions, coming up with new responses, deciding what knowledge can we pull out of these readings, et cetera, would all be examples of this. Another of the most common reasons to use discussions are student-to-student interaction. These are lacking online and they need to be more structured than in the classroom. So in the classroom, students sit beside their peers and they can lean over and they can chat and they can meet each other. But as we all have discovered, if we did not know before, this is not possible online unless you have, you know, all of your students in a Zoom room and you put them into rooms with pairs and they kind of lean over and talk to each other. But even then, that can take away from the learning if you have no purpose for doing that. In a recent survey done by the University of Alberta Students' Union, one of the clearest messages coming out is that students want to interact with each other, especially being at home and especially in this time. And one way to achieve that is through discussion, both asynchronously and synchronously. Discussion also promotes reflective judgment. So discussion can get at a really specific type of critical thinking skills where students engage with some kind of a prompt, engage with some type of a reading, and have to reflect before responding and providing answers. This is really important in asynchronous. And one of the benefits for asynchronous discussions over synchronous discussions is that students have that time to think and reflect before they respond. So something you will notice is on asynchronous discussions, students often tend to respond with longer responses, and they tend to respond they tend to have answers that are more connected to the readings because they can go back and they can pull things on. I have been in discussion with an instructor in the Faculty of Education, and she mentioned that she has noticed that students are connecting their material in their responses much better than they have in the past in her face-to-face classrooms. She's always done a lot of synchronous discussion, but with asynchronous, she's really noticing students are engaging with the material a lot deeper than they have in the past. This last one is something that I myself am starting to read upon, but it's this move from pedagogy to andragogy to hudagogy. Hudagogy is a relatively new term. I would suspect that most of you have heard about pedagogy, and a chunk of you will have heard about andragogy. Hudagogy will be something new. On Schoology.com, which is a place where they explain a lot of educational terms, they show this image. And I think this is a great way to capture those three terms. So, pedagogy is where we see terms like scaffolding, right? The instructor scaffolds learning, they build skills and give students places to practice content that they're first engaging with. You might see this in a lot of your first year courses. Then we want to be able to move students to andragogy. So in andragogy, this is where we have some structure still, but students can self-direct their learning. So a lot of discussion that we see online will be andragogical. It'll be, I'm posting some questions about a reading, and I want students to come up with what those answers are on their own. And then I'm going to reinforce whether or not they have met what my curriculum dictates they should be meeting. That's very andragogical. You're allowing students to develop some structure and learning goals. Hudagogy is something that you often see in capstone courses. And this is where we want to move students towards. This is an environment where learners determine their own goals, they determine their own learning paths, their processes, and their products. Ideally, students who are graduating from our programs are able to be pedagogical learners, and they can go out and create their own goals. So we want to move students, we want to increase the autonomy that's required in our courses, requiring more maturity and less instructor control and course structuring as they progress through their program. This could be an entire session on its own, but that's about as far as I'm going to go through these terms. The reason I bring this up is because discussion is one way to move from that pedagogy to andragogy. Okay, before we head into our next session, I'm going to model and show one of my favorite ways of running discussions. So a few pointers here. I find that a discussion tends to be more productive when students have something concrete to work on and a concrete way to return that material. This is specific to synchronous discussions. So when you're in a class, you might notice if you pose a discussion question and say, go back and talk about it. And then you come back and then you say, okay, what did we learn? And students kind of look at you. Mostly because, and that's a few reasons, right? And this is experience. Number one, they didn't talk about the question. They talked about something totally different, which happens all the time. Or number two, they got there and didn't know what they were supposed to do. So they just did whatever they thought they were supposed to do. And then they come back and it wasn't quite what you wanted. Um, so I like to give a really specific way of talking. And we're going to do this through Google Slides. That's how we're going to do a return of the information. We're going to put you back into your breakout rooms. And in your breakout rooms, you are going to answer the question, what makes a good online discussion? You can access the Google Slides that you'll need through the link that I've just posted in the chat. And I am going to show this because some people will have done this with me before and some people won't. What you will do is when you go into your breakout rooms, at the top of your screen, you will see breakout room and it'll have a number beside it. You can go onto these Google Slides, and if you click any of these numbers, it will take you to the slide for that group number. So if you were in breakout room 14, you would go to group 14, and here you can answer your question, what makes a good discussion? As the instructor, I will be able to see what everybody is typing while they're working through this. I can also view it in another form where I can see all the discussions here. But I will be able to see what you're typing. And that way I can get a gauge how far you are If there are any groups that have nothing typed, they might need a little help after a few minutes. And it's similar to walking around the classroom and kind of peeking in and seeing what people are doing. I will give you this template so that you can use this on your own in the follow-up email. But for now, if you could open up that Google Slides, if you haven't already, Graham, if you could put people into their breakout rooms. And again, I want to remind you the question we are discussing is what makes a good online discussion? So if I go into grid view, I could see while everyone was typing how they were progressing. And we got to a point where we saw that most groups had 2 or 3, like at minimum 2 or 3 points. And once I saw that, I said, okay, we're probably ready to come back. While I'm looking at this, I could say, okay, group 1, group 2 was going crazy. Like I could see them actually going off their slide. Group 5, some people were a little bit better at responding to this question. I did pop into a few groups who had not written anything early on. Now, I need to make a point about that. Just because somebody hasn't written something early on doesn't mean that they're not actually discussing. When I popped in, people were having in-depth discussions about what should go on there. So when I jumped in, my prompt was, why don't we include a few ideas on the slide so that we can have some things to share with everybody else? Because they were discussing, just those tangents were happening. And as a facilitator, that's part of my job, is to make sure that you're on task, but also that we're able to produce some kind of a product at the end that everyone can use. Another bonus to using Google Slides is that now when we're ready to talk about this, I can go into present mode and present each of the slides. So I could either call on somebody to present their slide, or I could talk about what we see here. As a group, I might say, okay, now take everybody's responses that they have. And as a group, I want you to come up with the top 2 or 3 responses. So I would put you back into groups to talk about everybody else's responses. Something that you might want to be careful of is when you're asking somebody to share, you always wind up with those 2 or 3 groups at the end who are like, well, everybody said everything that I wanted to share. To avoid that, you could make sure that you're starting in the middle sometimes. So not always starting with group 1. Sometimes you start with 6. Sometimes you start with 5. You could also ask students to share 1 or 2 of the most important things that they indicated instead of having them share everything that they've indicated. That also makes things go a little bit faster. Or as an instructor with this, I can go through and say, oh yeah, this is a really good point. So what makes a good discussion? Students apply what they're learning to the course. Absolutely. That is a very key point to discussion. When more questions come out of the discussion, great. I might actually take this and keep it as a student or as an instructor and use it later. So, here they asked a new, so they said when more questions come out of the discussion, it's a good discussion. And they had more questions come out of the discussion. Very meta group 2. How do you deal with students' expectations of more strict or traditional pedagogy? I'll try and speak to that in some of my slides here. I like the idea of having video on all the time, but I also want to recognize that I don't think it should be a requirement of students because, for privacy reasons, some students really don't want that on there. To encourage discussion, and something that I've noticed is students are a lot more willing to ask questions and be part of discussion by posting questions in the chat. So I like to leave the chat open for questions. And if I need anything further, I might say, Duncan, can you explain your question there? Because I just need a little bit more of a background here. Or you could pose, oh, hey, Kyle's asked a really good question. Does anybody want to comment on that? And open it up for students. In the classroom, you do need to have a wait time of approximately 3 to 5 seconds for students to respond. Online, I actually extend that and I count to about 7. It can be excruciating and it can be very quiet because everybody's staring at you. But Duncan popped up and asked his question at about 5. So I gave them time to think. What are the questions? Do I have a question? Do I want to ask that question? And then, okay, I'm going to ask that question right now. So I think that it's not whether their microphone is on or off all the time, but it's the amount of time that you pause and give students space to talk. The other thing that I encourage, and this is not necessarily related to, designing online discussions, but if you want students to pose questions to be part, is to ask, what are your questions, instead of, do you have any questions? So by asking, what are your questions, you are opening it and assuming, okay, everybody's probably got a question. Ask it. If you say, do you have any questions, it can imply that I shouldn't have questions at this point. The instructor is saying, we should all be where we are, and that's good. So this is something that I'm working on too. What are your questions? So let's talk a bit about designing discussions. The biggest thing in designing a discussion is asking, what should students gain through the participating in the discussion? Why are you having a discussion in the first place? And we were just talking about this. Make it very clear about what students are going to get out of that discussion and why you have included it and what are your reasons for this. Making that clear for students can make this a lot easier to get them to buy in, but it also shows them that you are consciously making a decision to include a discussion, not putting them in a discussion to put them in a discussion. Along those lines, when you've decided why or what students should gain through that discussion, you want to think about how will you introduce and start the discussion. So as I was mentioning, giving very specific instructions about how a discussion will occur can make it a lot easier on students, and it can make it a lot easier on you because you don't get a lot of those minimal questions, how do we, what do we, how many words do you want, those kinds of things. Think about how can you make the discussion inclusive, how can you foster trust and respect, and what are the outline guidelines that you want students to use. You also want to think about what are your expectations and ground rules and when and how students respond. The Faculty of Arts has put together a great resource called the Forum Decorum that explains their expectations in an online discussion environment. Instructors can use this, they can edit it, they can make a copy, edit, and share with their students. And the Forum Decorum lays out those norms for classroom discussion. As I said, you want to make sure you give very clear instructions. So here's some example instructions that you might see on a course page. Each student will contribute to the weekly class blog, posting an approximately 500-word response to the week's readings. So I've told them about how long the response will be. I've told them how often these will occur. And I've told them where they will post their discussion. In the response, you should at least answer the following questions. I've given 3 questions there for students to respond. Notice this is more on the pedagogy side, right? I'm really scaffolding this for students. As you're moving into upper year courses and you're moving into that andragogy adult education piece, you can leave it a little bit more open, but you still need to give them an idea of what to respond to. So if you say, respond to this week's readings, period, most students, not all, will feel a little lost and will have a lot of trouble answering that. So you could, for example, give instructions like, respond to this reading. Some things to consider would be include something that struck you, include a question that you had. What are some things about this reading that you are wondering? And giving them a little bit more direction as opposed to specific instructions. I prefer to be specific. I just find that I get better responses. And then a little bit of an instruction at the end of what you're expecting. Strive for thoughtfulness and nuance. To ensure that everyone has a chance to read the blog post before class, post your response by midnight the evening before class. So I've given a clear deadline. Sometimes you may have multiple deadlines. For example, you might say your initial post should be at this time, responses need to complete by this time. And it just depends on what you're looking for students to get out of that discussion forum. Yeah, if it's on eClass, there's actually a time stamp on the post. But if you were doing a blog, for example, blogs typically also have timestamps on them. So you could monitor that. Okay, so now we've talked about what should students gain, how will you introduce and start the discussion. The next thing to consider is what are you going to ask? What types of questions are you going to ask in a discussion forum? Well, there are certain types of questions that promote discussion better than others. And in a very short response, the answer is open questions. Typically, questions that do not have a correct answer, or questions that have multiple ways to get to one answer if there is a single answer, questions that require justification and or debate, provide better discussion. So for example, one of the discussion questions that I used today was what makes a good discussion? Yes, there is literature around this. There are answers about what makes a good discussion. I can give qualities about it, but there is still some room to debate and discuss those qualities about how much do I rely on open questions? How much do I rely on students' contributions? How much do I rely on me as an instructor going out and facilitating? But this almost always does come back to open questions. So there are some types of questions to consider. Again, I will give these slides out. So the first type of question that you want to think about is conceptual clarification questions. So asking students to think about concepts behind their arguments, specifically asking them to respond to something and indicate why. An example that I used in one of my educational technology courses is I said, okay, an instructor has come in or another teacher has come in and said, I hate using technology. It takes too much time to learn. And I asked, what would be your response and why would you give that response? So I asked students to explain to me, why are you saying that? And why is that your answer? Probing questions. This is something often that you'll be using as an instructor when you're facilitating. So for those of you who participated in the online discussion forum, you might have experienced this when you asked a question and I went in and said something like, that's a really good point. Have you thought about this? Right? What if you had done this? That's an interesting assumption. What if we look at it from this perspective? All of those would be probing questions. You could also do this in synchronous sessions by jumping into different rooms, listening to them and saying, what do you think about this? It's a little bit more difficult online because you can't necessarily hear the whole discussion, but it is something you can do. More probing, specifically around rationale, reasons, and evidence. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. What can you give me an example of that? Right? This is especially important for discussions when students share a point that can be a little bit difficult to see where they're coming from, or if they're missing some aspects. I don't quite understand your perspective here. Can you give me an example of what you're talking about? And coaching your students to ask these of other students can also be really helpful. I'm fortunate enough to teach in the Faculty of Education, and I have an entire lesson on asking good questions. So we work on this. But giving your students this at the beginning of the semester, especially if you're near the end of their degree program, these are the types of questions that you might ask in a discussion forum to make things a little more interesting. Could be a great strategy. Questioning viewpoints. Here you want to be careful. You want to make sure that you're coaching students to question viewpoints in a very professional and respectful way, right? This is going into justification. This is going into debate, but that is part of discussion, right? Asking questions to think about other ways of looking at things and coaching students to ask each other these types of questions. Probe implications and consequences. Oh, that's an interesting argument. What would happen next? This is very specific depending on the type of question, but especially if you're using something like case studies and they have to have a response to a case study, and then you could say, what might be the consequences of your response there? That's asking students to think really deeply about not only their answer, but how that might impact things. And always questions about the question. If this is not something that I tend to use in asynchronous questions, this might be something I use in synchronous session discussions. If I go into a session and students are really struggling, what do we do? How do we answer this? I might say, why do you think I asked the question? Because if they can see the context of the question, it's usually a little bit easier for them to answer. After figuring out what you're going to ask, the next point to think about is how are you going to facilitate the discussion? One question that Graham and I were asked very early on this summer was, how do I facilitate discussion without stopping everything? Because it seems like when an instructor jumps in and gives an answer, everybody stops because they just assume the instructor is correct. What I have found, the best way to facilitate discussion is to ask a question. So when I go in, and you would have noticed this on your discussion forums, there were a few points that I popped in and said, this is how you do that, because I responded to very technical, specific questions that way. They didn't really need a lot of debate. They didn't need a lot of discussion. But some points that were more pedagogical, things like, what are your perspectives on using multiple groups for discussions? I would go in and I would say, oh, this is how I think about it. But what do you think about this? Right? And I almost always answer a discussion with a question, especially if I'm working with students. Else it will tend to shut down the discussion, and students will stop at that instructor comment because they're a little bit more reluctant to disagree with you, or they may not feel like they can contribute as much with their students unless that's a culture that you create in your classroom. And this is a big one that lots of people ask about is, will you assess the discussion? And if so, how? A point that was raised is that students are more likely to participate in discussions if they're assessed. And this is true. Students are more likely to participate in anything if they're assessed, especially if it's worth more than 2% of their grade. But then the question becomes, how? So the first thing you need to do is go back to that first question. What should students gain through participating in the discussion? You're likely going to want to grade them on their achievement of the learning outcome in your class, but also part of this is going to be their contribution to discussion. So here's an example rubric that I might use to grade discussion forums. I prefer to grade them holistically, so I don't grade each individual comment. I'll grade students overall and say, for this week, this is how you participated. A few things I want to point out is on that 3 rating, that's the maximum any student can get. I always include something about students furthering conversations and posing questions of their peers, because those are the best strategies and skills in discussion to move it further and move it ahead. I haven't focused on quantity. I have focused on quality. Realistically, if a student posed one very good response that met all of those points in number 3, they could get a 3 out of 3 for this week. And I am okay with that, as long as they're showing those qualities that I need in a point or in a posting. The middle point, I often include some pieces like this. You'll see that last comment there. The student may offer many good posts, but dominates the class discussion. And the reason I put that in there is because you may see students trying to reach this 3, trying to reach that top by commenting on every single post. And if you have a group of 10 or 15, that gets to be very dominating in the discussion. It's not encouraging others to participate. It's focusing on their participation. And what you want to do is encourage other people to participate. And I will share this rubric so that you can have it. So when you're thinking about discussion as a summary, these are the 5 questions that you want to think about before you post a discussion. What are they gaining through participating? Else, why are you including a discussion and being very explicit about that? How will you introduce and start the discussion? Can everyone access the discussion? Can everyone be part of this? What will you ask? How will you facilitate? And will you assess it? And if so, how? Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
Just a little point. If you decide you're going to mark participation or engagement in an online discussion, then think about how that's going to reflect on an impact on your own workload and the workload of your TAs and RAs. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be aware of that. If you've decided to go down that route, that's a lot of extra work, and it may be worth it. But just make sure you keep yourself sane, is what I'm saying.
Totally agree. I think discussions in general can take a lot of bandwidth and can take a lot of time, right? So this is why using discussions, it should be done very purposefully. I think that having a discussion every week is probably going to burn students out, especially if it's asynchronous. Synchronous sessions, you can get away with a bit more because they don't necessarily need the time to stop and think and pause.